Welcome back to ESCAP's e-learning series on public-private partnerships. In this module, we'll go through an overview of the PPP project cycle. We will start by looking at how you can identify suitable projects for PPP implementation before reviewing the preparation required for the development of a business case. We will then guide you through the key steps in the transaction of a PPP project, leading up to the selection of a private partner. Finally, we will consider some management-related issues that may arise once a PPP project is operational. The first phase is called project identification. Identifying an infrastructure project is typically the result of a government's planning process. Once a project is selected as a priority, it must be determined whether the project should be implemented as a PPP or follow the traditional procurement process. In making this determination, you should consider which procurement method will bring the highest value. To make that decision, you use a specific set of criteria to assess the suitability of PPP implementation for a project. These criteria include the scale of a project. Is the project big enough? PPP projects are costly to prepare due to their complexity. And a project must be large enough to justify the increased transaction costs. Another criterion concerns the extent of infrastructure needs. PPPs work best when there is a long-term, predictable need for infrastructure. You don't want to sign a 20-year contract only to realize after a few years you have no longer need for that infrastructure. You must also monitor the performance of the private sector, which means that the project should have clearly defined output arrangements. It's additionally important to determine whether local private sector organizations have the capacity to manage this kind of long-term project. If local capacity is limited, is there an appetite from international investors? These are some of the criteria you should consider when undertaking a preliminary value for money qualitative assessment. The question you are trying to answer is whether the project is likely to bring more value if implemented as a PPP rather than through the traditional procurement process. As with any infrastructure project, you must also conduct a pre-feasibility analysis in the identification phase. Such an analysis entails collecting basic information regarding the project's scope and objectives. You should also assess the degree of technical, legal, and financial viability of the project and consider the need for public financial support. Based on these considerations, you can determine whether a project has the potential to be developed as a PPP, and in which case you should obtain internal clearance to proceed with the preparation phase. The second phase is project preparation, which begins with the preparation of the project's business case. First, the viability of the project should be confirmed through full-scale feasibility studies, which are basically extensions of the pre-feasibility studies carried out during the identification phase. You must then conduct technical studies to determine the output requirements of the project and confirm technical feasibilities. You should seek to answer questions like, are established technologies capable of delivering the project objectives? You must also estimate the probable capital and operational costs of the project. Following this, you should assess the socio-economic benefits of the project. What will be the impact on job creation, on economic growth? Do the project's economic benefits exceed its economic costs? In other words, Does the project make sense in socio-economic terms? Next, you should consider financial elements. How many people will be using the public services? How much revenue can be generated? What are the expected returns? Is the project bankable? Such determinations require the development of a financial model which can simulate different scenarios based on different assumptions. The financial analysis should also include a review of the fiscal sustainability of the project. Is the project affordable for the government? Are there alternatives to minimize the demand on government finances? Will the government be able to provide the subsidies required for the project? Potential legal and regulatory challenges need to be reviewed as well. For example, is there a clear legal basis for the government to enter into a PPP structure for the project? You should also assess the risk of delays to the project by regulatory constraints. After all of this, you must consider potential adverse social and environmental effects. Will the project require any population resettlement? Will the project result in increased carbon emissions? Will the project comply with social and environmental standards? The preparation of the business case additionally requires that you define the roles and responsibilities of each partner. What is the proposed risk allocation? Risk allocation is a critical factor as it can determine the potential for success of a PPP project as well as its attractiveness for private investors. You can then determine whether there is an appetite for the proposed project from the private investors by organizing market-sounding activities like roadshows. In addition to this, you should consider the success of similar projects in attracting interest from private investors. With all of this information collected, you will be in a position to better refine your value for money analysis and confirm whether a PPP is the most appropriate procurement method for your prospective project. Some countries use quantitative assessment to compare the estimated costs of a proposed PPP structure with those of traditional procurement. This is called a public sector comparator. While this can offer advantages, its implementation can be difficult, as a public sector comparator requires a lot of data and has a number of methodological limitations. Because of this, not all countries choose to employ these quantitative assessments. At the conclusion of the project preparation phase, you should have all the information required to seek approval to proceed to the transaction phase. Approval is necessary to confirm the political buy-in for a project and to avoid spending transaction costs on projects that are unlikely to succeed. The third stage of the PPP project cycle is the project transaction phase. The transaction phase should be guided by the principles of competition, fairness, and transparency. Without these conditions, private investors are unlikely to participate in the bidding, and the results for the public authority are bound to be unsatisfactory. To launch the transaction process, you need first to prepare the bidding documents, the most important of which is the draft PPP contract. The draft contract clearly articulates the proposal for prospective private sector partners and defines the roles and responsibilities of parties involved. Preparing the transaction also requires developing a procurement strategy. What will be the criteria used to evaluate candidates? How much interaction with the bidders will be allowed during the transaction? Such interaction can improve a project proposal by incorporating bidder recommendations, which can then be valuable in complex projects such as PPPs. Interaction can also potentially hinder transparency. and steps must be taken to mitigate any corruption risks. During the pre-tender phase, you can further publicize the project by holding a pre-bid conference with potential bidders and issuing a procurement notice to inform investors about the upcoming project. Next is pre-qualification, the issuance of a request for qualification, RFQ. It's the first step in the transaction. This set of documents gives information to potential investors on the key commercial terms of the project and on the overall bidding process and the criteria to pre-qualify. Through pre-qualification, you want to select only companies with the required experience capacity and resources to handle the project. You don't want to select companies that won't be able to deliver. You want to finish with a limited pool of pre-qualified bidders, for example, 3 to 6. This should be enough to maintain competitive pressure while facilitating interaction with the bidders. This additionally increases the prospect of success to each bidder, and if bidders have higher chances of success, they are more likely to invest in the bidding process. The bidding process begins at the conclusion of pre-qualification. A full set of bidding documents, including the draft PPP contract, is sent to each pre-qualified bidder at the outset of the bidding process. Bidders then have an opportunity to clarify any grey areas of the draft PP contract with the contracting agency. To facilitate this, a conference is usually organised where all pre-qualified bidders may seek clarifications to the bidding documents. After this, pre-qualified bidders can submit their proposals. If you have opted for a single-stage process, bidders submit both their technical and financial proposals simultaneously. If you have decided to allow more interaction with the bidders via a two-stage process, bidders submit technical proposals first. Parties can then discuss the proposals and potentially amend the bidding documents. The revised bidding documents are then issued and bidders can start preparing both their technical and financial proposals. The evaluation phase follows the closure of the bidding process. If you have opted for the selection based on the financial criteria with a two-envelope system, you first open the technical proposal and assess it on a pass-fail basis. If the technical proposal is accepted, you review the corresponding financial proposal. The financial proposal can be evaluated against criteria such as lowest tariffs for users or lowest cost to the government. You may also decide to base the evaluation on a combination of financial and technical criteria. While this approach has its advantages, it also allows for increased chances of subjective assessment, thereby increasing the risk of corruption. Following evaluation results, a preferred bidder is selected and the final negotiations commence. These negotiations aim at clarifying any remaining issues and updating the contract with the proposed specifics of the preferred bidder. No material changes can be made to the contract agreed upon during the bidding phase. This ensures the process remains fair to the other bidders, who might have submitted different proposals had they known that the contract could be amended after the fact. Pressure to make changes to the contract can come from lenders as well, and it's during this stage that the preferred bidder finalises its loan agreements. Lenders might threaten not to finance the project if their requests to amend the contract are not taken on board, thereby jeopardizing the whole process. Once the contract is finalized, it is submitted for approval by a public authority. The project will then be ready for launch, provided that the financing agreements have also been finalized and that the conditions precedent contained in the agreements have been fulfilled. Such conditions could include obtaining the permits required to launch construction or acquiring a certain percentage of land. The project reaches then its final close, which means that the funds can be dispersed to implement it. Up to now, we've examined a situation where projects are initiated by the government, but there's another possibility. Projects can also be proposed directly to the government by the private sector. These are what we call unsolicited bids. To decide whether unsolicited proposals should be accepted, you must carefully weigh their pros and cons. On the one hand, the private sector can be a good source of ideas for infrastructure projects. The government can also benefit from well-prepared proposals and innovative solutions identified by the private sector. On the other hand, such proposals can divert government attention from more pressing matters. Unsolicited proposals may not correspond with national priorities, and assessing them is costly and requires mobilizing internal resources. Allowing the private sector to make proposals directly to the government can also increase the risk of corruption. If you decide to accept unsolicited proposals, you need to establish mechanisms to introduce competition. A variety of methods to this end exist. The most common method is the Swiss challenge, where additional parties are invited to submit competing proposals. The initial party is, however, given the opportunity to match those competing proposals. Having reviewed the steps in the establishment of a PPP, we can now look at the management of a project during its operational phase. In order to be successful, a PPP project must develop clear procedures for project management and allocate sufficient resources to monitor the private partner performance and to enforce penalties if required. Among other things, the management procedures should establish efficient communication channels. For example, clear reporting requirements should be imposed on the private partner so the public authority remains informed of project progress and can identify potential problems early on. Project management procedures should also establish protocols to implement the continuous adjustments that are likely to be required throughout the life of a long-term project. For example, procedures should be established in case the contract needs to be renegotiated as a result of unforeseen events. The PPP unit could support the implementing agency in coping with such complex issues. Successful management of a PPP project also requires the establishment of efficient dispute resolution mechanisms to settle differences amongst public and private partners quickly and fairly. Contract management includes dealing with the end of a contract and issues such as termination payments and the conditions of an asset at the end of a contract. That concludes our presentation on the PPP project cycle. We hope you have enjoyed it. Thanks for watching and for your interest in the work of ESCAP. Please check out ESCAP's website for more information and additional resources on PPPs at www.unescap.org.